Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and welcome to Fully Equipped. Chapter 3 is another shorter chapter, but it's still important. It concludes the first section of this letter, which is mostly praise and thanksgiving to the church. You'll find that in a lot of Paul's letters, the body of the letter is often clearly divided into two main parts. The first part is a lot of doctrine and explanation, and then the second part is application. He gives them instructions and commands for how to live a holy life before God. We'll see more of that over the next couple of days, but today Paul's continuing to explain why he hasn't been present with the Thessalonians. He also shares about Timothy's good report of their church, and he prays for them. All of this highlights Paul's pastoral heart and his love for this church. Back in Acts 17, we read about how Paul, Silas, and Timothy were pushed out of Thessalonica by the Jews. Then they went on to Berea, but the Jews caught up to them there as well. So Paul sailed off to Athens, but left Silas and Timothy behind. Eventually, they joined him in Athens, but then Paul was concerned about the churches he had just founded in Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. So Paul sent Timothy back to Thessalonica to check on them, because there was persecution going on against them. Silas probably went somewhere else in Macedonia, leaving Paul alone in Athens. And this highlights to the church how much Paul cared for them. He was willing to make this sacrifice for them and be alone in Athens in order to check in on them and make sure that they were doing okay. That's why he sent Timothy to them. He wanted them to be encouraged and to grow. It's cool how Paul calls Timothy God's co-worker, right? That's what we get to be as well. We join in and participate in what God's doing here on the earth. We're working with him to see his kingdom come. There is continuing persecution in Thessalonica towards the church that's growing there. And Paul, deeply concerned for them, wanted to ensure that their faith was still strong. It's interesting that he's concerned for their faith and not so much about their suffering. He's worried that they will turn from Jesus, not that they might endure hard things. This really speaks to Paul's eternal perspective. He knows that they might endure suffering for a short time now, but that's nothing compared to the eternity that waits us when we die or Jesus returns. However, when we go through suffering and hard times, Satan can use that to try and pull us away from our faith, to get us to question God, whether he's truly good or faithful or worth following, to get us to question eternity or salvation or whether God is even real in the first place. Satan wants to pull us away from God. But we can be encouraged that Satan does not have any control over us. When Jesus came and died for us, he defeated Satan's power over us. As we continue to resist the enemy, act in spiritual warfare, and choose to live holy lives, Satan continues to be defeated. And one day, God will defeat him completely when Jesus returns again. But Paul reminds us that we, as Christians, are destined for affliction in this lifetime. We shouldn't be surprised when suffering comes. He actually reminded the Thessalonians over and over again that believers will face persecution in this life. He wasn't preaching an easy gospel or saying that if they believe, they will have easy lives. But here's the good news. When we stand firm in God, we're established in holiness. We're saved. When Jesus returns, we'll be counted as righteous. And when that day comes, there will be no more tears, no more suffering, no more pain. We'll be rejoicing and feasting and worshiping in the presence and glory of God. That's what brings Paul great encouragement. When Timothy met up with him in Corinth and gave his good report of the Thessalonian church, Paul is glad to hear that they are firm in their faith in the Lord. Paul too is suffering for the gospel, but all of them together are suffering for Jesus, who is worthy of it all. Paul shares with them that he wishes he could come back to be with them and continue to teach them. He was only with them a short time, and there was not enough time to fully instruct them in fundamental Christian doctrine. That's part of the reason why the Thessalonians are confused about what happens after death for believers. The final section of this chapter is a small prayer for the Thessalonian church. Paul prays that he will be able to return to them, and that they will grow in love for others. This prayer actually links the two big sections of the letter together. The first 3 chapters were a lot about Paul's relationship with the church, and the second half is about living blamelessly in light of Jesus' return. Blamelessness and holiness are big themes in chapters 4 and 5. So Paul's prayer highlights that as they grow in love, they will also grow in holiness. And if they want to be part of those taken to be with Jesus when he returns, they should also be seeking to live holy lives. They are saved, and now they are being sanctified, made more righteous, until they die or Jesus returns. And that's what Paul will give more guidance about in the coming chapters. How does this equip us? At the end of chapter 2, we read that Satan hindered Paul from being with the church. And in chapter 3, we were reading about how Satan tempts people and seeks to bring them away from God and faith in him. So we see that Satan has the ability to influence us and affect us. But in Paul's prayer at the end of the chapter, he prays that God will direct their way back to the church. Ultimately, Paul knows that God is sovereign. Satan has influence, but God has the final say, always. And like Paul, we can pray against the influence of the enemy in our lives. We can take comfort knowing that God has sovereignty over Satan as well. Satan and God are not in an arm wrestle fighting for dominance. God has all power over Satan. And whilst sometimes we can be discouraged by all of the darkness and evil and suffering in the world, we can also take heart knowing that God works all things for our good. What hard things are you facing right now? What seemingly impossible situations are you in? Where does it feel like Satan is winning? When we're rooted in the conviction that God is all-powerful, even over the enemy, we can come to him with faith and hope, knowing that he is trustworthy and good. So let's be people who face hard things trusting that God's in control, that he's sovereign over our lives, and that there are no better hands to be in than his.